Since I was 12, I've been absolutely in love with the I Am Legend franchise. My introduction to I Am Legend was the 2007 film starring Will Smith. While watching that film, I recall my dad making references to another film that the 2007 film lifted some of its scenes from. That intrigued me. As far as I knew, as a 9-10-year-old, I Am Legend was the only film. Eventually, I came across a YouTube movie review talking about I Am Legend. This would have been 13 years ago, so back in 2009. So I can't remember what the channel was called, but due to it being 2009, before everyone and their mother had access to powerful visual effects and video editors, it was mostly an unedited and raw movie review. However, the person in the video talked about how most people don't know that I Am Legend is not an original film. It's been made twice before as The Last Man on Earth and The Omega Man. I then realized that The Omega Man was the movie that my dad was talking about when we watched I Am Legend back in 2007. At that time, The Last Man on Earth was available on Hulu, I believe. I decided to watch it. I was 12, so I didn't exactly have an appreciation for older movies like I do now. And even now, The Last Man on Earth isn't my cup of tea. Following that, however, I then watched The Omega Man on YouTube. It was uploaded in 12 or 13 parts, and I absolutely fell in love with The Omega Man. However, there was one important missing piece. I still had no idea that all these movies were based on a book. Finally, around the age of 15, after doing some research and wanting to revisit I Am Legend and The Omega Man, I learned that there was a book that started it all, titled I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, published in 1954. I had no money as a 15-year-old. I wouldn't have a job until I turned 16, so I had no access to the book. But I read the plot summary on Wikipedia, and I'll use the Wayback Machine to present to you the plot summary I was blessed with. Neville discovers a note stating that the infected have slowly overcome their disease until they can spend short periods of time in the sunlight and are attempting to rebuild society, but fear and hate Neville, who has destroyed some of their people, along with the true vampires' dead bodies animated by the germ, during his daytime excursions against the latter. Ruth warns Neville that her people will attempt to capture him, and that he should leave his house and escape. But Neville disregards Ruth's warning and is captured. Neville wakes up in a prison where he is visited by Ruth, who informs him that she is a ranking member of the new society, but unlike the others, she does not resent him. She acknowledges the need for Neville's execution, and gives him pills, claiming they will make it easier. Badly injured, Neville accepts his fate, and asks Ruth not to let this society become heartless. Ruth kisses him and leaves. Neville goes to his prison window and sees all the infected waiting for his execution. Judging by their reactions to the sight of him, he comprehends their point of view. Having hitherto seen the destruction of the infected survivors as a moral imperative to be pursued for his own and mankind's survival, he realizes that even as vampires were legend in pre-infection times, he, a remnant of old humanity, is legend to the new race born of the infection. He therefore remarks to himself as he dies, "I am a new superstition entering the unassailable fortress of forever. I am legend." For those of you wondering why I used the Wayback Machine rather than the current up-to-date Wikipedia article, just remain patient. I will explain in just a moment. As an aficionado of film, enjoyer of cinema, and wannabe filmmaker in search of entertainment and thoughtful discussion, I find myself partial to video essays centered around movies and storytelling. Back then, after realizing most people don't know about the prior films of I Am Legend, or even being ignorant of the fact that there is even a book, like myself, I figured the best place I could find any information or conversation around this would be on YouTube. Strangely, the video essays talking about the I Am Legend franchise are rather lacking. With that being said, everything I watched on YouTube, or read outside of YouTube, which mentioned the novel in contrast with its subsequent adaptations, would describe the novel in the same fashion as the Wikipedia article I just read to you. They were all describing the book the same way. Fast forward a few years into the future, as an adult, I had more money, and I finally, as an 18-year-old, decided to pick up the I Am Legend novel. Following my reading of it, I was confused because the novel did not depict the ending that I thought it would. Fast forward 7 years, I'm now 25 as I'm making this video, I yearned to revisit the series once again, and upon revisiting the franchise and there being more video essays talking about the franchise, I was once again reminded of how my expectations were originally subverted. Let's just say there are two different things that are going on. A, the YouTubers writing video essays about the series are too lazy to actually read the material they are talking about. B, there's a cohort of individuals who want to present themselves as profound, sophisticated, hipster, or refined, and thus they pretend to actually read books. This goes beyond the movie adaptations are always worse crowd. I understand that cohort of people, and I respect them more than the people who pretend to read books. And those two things can combine and make what is C, which is, well, let's be honest, the vast majority of video essayists are enamored by their own projection of their own inflated sense of profundity. All these YouTubers talking about the franchise who mention the book are either lying or their IQs are so low that they are incapable of simultaneously analyzing two separate concepts and events at the same time. Somehow this summary of Richard Matheson's I Am Legend has permeated its way through the collective minds of video essayists and YouTube commenters who are simply too lazy to actually read the book or even listen to the audiobook. Now, I don't believe whatsoever that I'm a better person for having read the book, nor do I think that people who don't read are somehow inferior. I don't think enjoying reading elevates me to a level of sophistication or intelligence above the layman. Condescension annoys me. What also annoys me are individuals who project their facade of profundity in the form of a video essay when they're too damn lazy to read the actual material they're supposedly covering. I know that a lot of these individuals are college educated, and sometimes the process of writing essays and doing research involves just skimming and reading summaries rather than spending a lot of time really diving into the material. But in terms of a video essay about works of fiction, I expect a certain level of expertise and accuracy. I don't give a shit about your philosophical ramblings that you derived from a certain work of art if it's based on a pretense. I want your philosophical ramblings to be actual abstractions from something you've actually consumed and contemplated. It's like watching a movie review from a YouTuber who didn't actually watch the movie, or taking medical advice from someone who read a health textbook one time. Having actually read the book, it drives me crazy to see the poorly written Wikipedia article from 2012 regurgitated in a fucking video essay. I've been rambling on long enough, now it's time to get more specific. Reading that Wikipedia article, filtered through the Wayback Machine, you may be led to the conclusion that Robert Neville was killing vampires, and the vampires, in retaliation, arrest Neville, who has become a sort of boogeyman. He's become a boogeyman because the vampires he was killing were actually starting to form their own society. They were starting their own civilization, but this lunatic was killing them in their sleep. If that's your interpretation of the novel of I Am Legend, due to reading that summarized somewhere and actually having it regurgitated by a video essay on YouTube, I understand. To be clear, my gripe isn't with you. It's with people who lie and pretend to read to either make videos or to sound more profound. Being misled about a piece of pop culture or media with a cult following is not your fault. Not everyone reads as their form of entertainment, and that's okay. So to dispel some of the myths perpetuated by some of these YouTubers and actually explain the plot of the book, I'll directly respond to what it is that is being said. Then I'll quickly go over the updated Wikipedia article, explain the inaccuracies of the older article, and then move on to a more in-depth film analysis of the I Am Legend franchise.
Good guys, when really we've nearly destroyed each other on multiple occasions. In fact, we still are. In the case of I Am Legend, we discover that the vampires Neville is killing are just as functional as humans and share an equal hatred and fear towards Neville as he has for them. In their eyes, he's the monster attacking them, in the same way he sees them as the monsters attacking him. Both sides are on equal standing, and what takes it a step further is how the story uses the conventions of the fantasy fiction template that humans are good and monsters are bad, and completely subverts it in such a way that while narratively speaking, Neville is the hero of his own story, in the context to what the world has become, he fits closer to the premise of the monster. Essentially, the title of the story, I Am Legend, is rooted in this one idea. Robert Neville is the boogeyman, the Baba Yaga, the monster that hides under your bed, the creature that lurks in the shadows, insert whatever other urban myth you want to compare him to. Basically, he's the true threat to this world because, well, it's not his world anymore.
By stripping him of the negative traits of the Neville of the book, by making his intentions more noble and sacrificial.
Let me save you!
In the book, he's looking for a cure, yes, but more like a hobby out of boredom than to save the world or rectify man's wrongs. He's resigned to being alone, and instead of just kidnapping a few test subjects for the sake of the greater good, he spends his days going door to door, slaughtering the vampires where they sleep. He is actively murdering them left and right. And when he finds out at the end of the story that they were more than mindless monsters or reanimated corpses, that the people he was killing still had feelings and consciousness and formed a society where they had adapted and coped to their new state, he realizes that he truly has become what he thought he was fighting against all along, and that they are all innocents.
They were afraid. They didn't know.
True, he didn't know, but in his case, it's pure ignorance without any sort of noble cause behind it, like the 2007 movie gives Will Smith. Matheson wrote Neville to be so much more monstrous in his causeless killing, like an animal might do for survival, and that is why he is legend.
This next one really takes the cake, because it's a guy claiming to have actually read the novel. And to be fair, his review is mostly accurate until he gets to the ending and then describes his interpretation of said ending.
Cutting ending of the book becomes very clear here. So it turns out these vampires are highly intelligent people who fear this man. He is their boogeyman. When he's out hunting during the day, killing them in their sleep, he has become this mythical monster, this legend to them. I am legend. It's in the title. It's very important that they are in highly intelligent society. They are people who have feelings and emotions. He's murdered wives, husbands, and children. And then you look at the movie, and he killed rabid people. So it's much less, you don't feel as much. In fact, there's really no point in the book where these vampires seem to be malicious. And in hindsight, rereading the book, they're clearly defending themselves. It's basically them trying to take out their version of Frankenstein. They're terrified of him just as he is terrified of them.
This one baffles me the most because this guy not only claims to have read the book, he also claims to have reread the book.
But the most controversial change that the filmmakers made was ending the film on a heroic, uplifting note, instead of using the novel's dark, ironic twist ending. For those of you who have not read the book, Neville is captured by a group of infected survivors who are creating a new society and want Neville to be executed for killing their friends and family. The twist is that Neville, without realizing it, has become the monster that everyone fears. The man you thought was the hero was actually the villain the entire time.
So, I think I've spent enough time showing how the novel is repeatedly summarized. Keep all of that in mind. Let's just take a gander at the updated Wikipedia article. Neville's continued readings and experiments on incapacitated vampires help him create new theories. He believes vampires are affected by mirrors and crosses because of hysterical blindness, the result of previous psychological conditioning of the infected. Driven insane by the disease, the infected now react as they believe they should when confronted with these items. Even then, their reaction is constrained to the beliefs of the particular person. For example, a Christian vampire would fear the cross, but a Jewish vampire would not. Neville additionally discovers more efficient means of killing the vampires, other than just driving a stake into their hearts. This includes exposing vampires to direct sunlight or inflicting wide, oxygen-exposing wounds anywhere on their bodies, so that the bacteria switch from being anaerobic symbionts to aerobic parasites, rapidly consuming their hosts when exposed to air, which gives the appearance of the vampires instantly liquefying. However, the bacteria also produce resilient body glue that instantly seals blunt or narrow wounds, making the vampires bulletproof. With this new knowledge, Neville is killing such a large number of vampires in his daily forays that his nightly visits have diminished significantly. Neville further believes the pandemic was spread not so much by direct vampire bites as by bacteria-bearing mosquitoes and dust storms in the cities following a recent war. The inconsistency of Neville's results in handling vampires also leads him to realize that there are in fact two differently reacting types of vampires, those conscious and living with a worsening infection, and those who have died but been reanimated by the bacteria, in other words, undead. After 3 years, Neville sees a terrified woman in broad daylight. Neville is immediately suspicious after she recoils violently in the presence of garlic, but they slowly win each other's trust. Eventually, the two comfort each other romantically, and he explains some of his findings, including his theory that he developed immunity against the infection after being bitten by an infected vampire bat years ago. He wants to know if the woman, named Ruth, is infected or immune, vowing to treat her if she is infected, and she reluctantly allows him to take a blood sample, but suddenly knocks him unconscious as he views the results. When Neville wakes, he discovers a note from Ruth confessing that she is indeed a vampire, sent to spy on him, and that he was responsible for the death of her husband, another vampire. The note further suggests that only the undead vampires are pathologically violent, but not those who were alive at the time of the infection, and who survive due to chance mutations in their bacteria. These living infected have slowly overcome their disease, and are attempting to rebuild a new society. They have developed medication that diminishes the worst of their symptoms. Ruth warns Neville that her feelings for him are true, but that her people will attempt to capture him, and that he should try to escape the city. However, Neville stays at his house, assuming he will be treated fairly by the new society of living infected. However, he suddenly watches a group of living infected violently murder the undead vampires outside his house with a fiendish glee. Frightened that the infected attackers may intend to kill him after all, Neville fires on them, and in turn is shot and subdued. Fatally wounded, he is placed in a barred cell where he is visited by Ruth, who informs him that she is a senior member of the new society, but, unlike the others, she does not resent him. After discussing the effects of Neville's vampire-killing activities on the new society, she acknowledges the public need for Neville's execution, but, out of mercy, gives him a packet of fast-acting suicide pills. Neville accepts his fate and asks Ruth not to let this society become too heartless. Ruth promises to try, kisses him, and leaves. Neville goes to his prison window and sees the infected staring back at him with the same hatred and fear that he once felt for them. He realizes that he, a remnant of old humanity, is now a legend to the new race of the infection. He recognizes that their desire to kill him after he has killed so many of their loved ones is not something he can condemn. As the pills take effect, he is amused by the thought that he will become their new superstition and legend, just as vampires once were to humans. I hope that in this point of the video that my tedious and ostensible ramblings start to make sense. Would you have guessed that there's two different factions of vampires given the old Wikipedia article and the summarizations of the novel in the previous 4 videos I presented? Admittedly, the old Wikipedia article does make mention of undead and living vampires, but the summary is so poorly written and the distinction is hardly emphasized that it's overshadowed by the rest of the summarizing plot points. The article leads you to believe that the vampires are adapting and are now taking over the world, and that Neville is evil. It doesn't make any mention of the feral nature of the undead or true vampires. It fails to mention the swift brutality by which the living vampires dispose of the undead vampires. It fails to mention the violent nature of the feral fiends. In fact, none of the videos I showed you even make mention of the two different factions of vampires. Instead, while pretending to analyze the nuance of the novel and lack thereof in its film adaptations, the YouTube videos, which are depicted as in-depth reviews and video essays, drop all context and present the novel as evil man killing good people. Let's revisit the points made in the videos. Ryan Hollinger claims, in the case of I Am Legend, we discover the vampires Neville is killing are just as functional as humans, and share an equal hatred and fear towards Neville as he has towards them. In their eyes, he's the monster attacking them, in the same way he sees them as monsters attacking him. Both sides are on equal standing. So the question is, which vampires are in equal standing? Because halfway through the novel is when Robert Neville discovers there's 2 different kinds of vampires. Ryan also claims that Neville is the true threat in the world because, well, it's not his world anymore. That isn't entirely true. While yes, you can claim that he is indeed the last uninfected human in the world, and the world as he knew it came to an end, Robert Neville could have very easily existed in their world. He literally has sexual intercourse with Ruth, the vampire woman sent to spy on him. Ruth develops feelings for him and loves him and empathizes with him. In fact, the living vampires were attempting to dispatch of their more vampiric and feral traits as they themselves saw vampirism as something negative. Is there an element of him being a remnant of the old human world? Yes, but that point is not as emphasized as people summarizing the book claim it is. In the Vampire Reviews video, she claims that Robert is looking for a cure out of boredom. Now, this has a grain of truth to it. Yes, Robert Neville is bored, but his drive to find a cure isn't paved by intentions of curing boredom. It's due to his desire to live. Robert Neville, in the book, is alone and desperate for companionship. He's depressed, but the possibility of a cure gives him enough hope to last in the vampiric nightmare for over 3 years. She then goes on to claim that he was murdering vampires left and right and that they were more than mindless monsters. They were forming a society. Again, this point is lifted directly from that poorly written Wikipedia article that has permeated its way into the consciousness of media reviewers and media YouTube essayists. Many of the vampires he was killing were indeed mindless monsters. They were feral fiends, the bane of existence who deserve to be slaughtered with brute force. You can make the argument that what I showed you from the YouTubers attempting to analyze the book are just summarizations. Thus, it's inevitable that context and nuances will be dropped. The summaries I presented to you are blatant misrepresentations. The vampires are not kind and innocent. The book doesn't solely focus on the idea that Robert Neville is the villain. The vampires aren't just defending themselves. Also, the ending of the book makes it crystal clear that there's not just vampires. Let's really dive into the nuances of the book, albeit vaguely dive in. At the beginning of the novel, Robert Neville is alone and attempting to survive. He's in his fortified house, and since these are vampires he's dealing with, things like garlic, religious symbols, and so are enough to help repel the undead nightmare outside his house. And let's all be adults here. With the exception of asexually driven individuals, we all experience a bit of lust and desire to fulfill sexual desires. Now, imagine being alone, being the last man on Earth, being the last human on Earth. That part is important. The feral and brutal monsters outside of his house are using the women to lure Neville out of the house. Of course, it's dark, so all Neville sees is their feminine silhouette. The vampires are trying to sexually entice Robert to leave his house, so the vampires can kill him. However, when the sun rises and Neville leaves his house to clean up and collect supplies, he makes note of the trampled vampire women. The vampires are mindless savages, and they don't care about women. In the book, they force the women to stay up until the very end in their best attempt to lure Neville out. Therefore, the women die. Not only that, but he sees many vampires trampled to death, specifically the women, because there is a complete disregard for the humanity of the other vampires. The book, again, is explicitly clear that these vampires are not good people. Neville in the book is obviously in a state of depression. He has suicidal thoughts. However, in direct contradiction to what the girl from Vampire Reviews said, Neville doesn't search for a cure out of boredom. He begins searching for a cure as a means to stay alive. Yes, part of it is boredom. In the book, both Robert's daughter, Kathy, and his wife, Virginia, succumb to the plague. The proper thing to do, according to law, after someone dies in this world from the infection, is to bring their body to a burn pit. Robert Neville violates the law and buries his wife. That very same night, Virginia returns to her house as a reanimated corpse, or a vampire, with a desire to drink Neville's blood. Thus, Neville is required to stake her. Does that sound like an innocent person? Moving on Neville's quest to cure the plague, he begins experimenting on the vampires. The plague is caused by bacteria. Robert concludes that garlic repels vampires because of its antibiotic properties. Sunlight also works because UV radiation kills bacteria. The vampires are somewhat resistant to certain types of trauma because the bacteria clots wounds. This makes certain types of small arms fire ineffective, but wooden stakes are effective due to their size. He concludes that crosses don't have any real effect on vampires, but the negative reaction that some vampires have when exposed to a cross is due to the beliefs of the infected before they die. A non-Christian vampire wouldn't be affected by seeing a cross. However, later on in the book, Neville notices that there are vampires who don't look quite as dilapidated as the others, and some of his experiments are failing on certain vampires. Robert meets a woman. She's visibly scared of him. Eventually, she goes to his house, they talk, she begins to trust him, and they share an intimate moment. Neville, in his quest to search for a cure and desire to keep his seemingly human woman alive, decides to test her blood. Right when Neville discovers her infection, she blindsides him and knocks him out. He wakes up and reads a note left by Ruth explaining that Robert killed her husband and many civilized vampires. She explains that she developed feelings for him as well as a strong sense of empathy. Ruth tells him that she's part of a new society. They've found a way to survive the infection, they've found a way to suppress the feral and violent symptoms of the plague, and she tells Robert that they are far more human than the undead monstrosities. She warns him that he should leave as he's going to be confronted by her new society. Neville doesn't leave. Night falls. The usual feral vampires are outside his house trying to get him to come out. But then a gang of vampires from the new society come up and start executing the undead vampires outside of Neville's house with sheer violence and utter disregard for any semblance of humanity. In fact, Robert begins to feel more sympathy for the undead feral creatures of the night because this gang of vampires from the new society are acting barbarically. Robert knew he only killed out of survival. He didn't enjoy killing the vampires, but this new society, they're having fun murdering the other vampires. Robert then starts to worry for his old friend, Ben Cortman. Cortman, an old friend of Neville and his family before the plague, used to carpool together. However, Cortman eventually caught the virus and died, and then he reanimated and became a vampire. And every night, Cortman is outside Neville's house taunting him and calling him by name. However, as Neville is watching the violence outside, he sees Cortman attempting to flee to a chimney on top of the roof of a house across the street. Neville feels stupid because he realizes in his search for vampires, and specifically Cortman, that he wasn't as thorough as he thought he was. But he's also sickened and upset because these brutal gangsters of the new society are shredding Cortman apart with gunfire. Cortman's body is violently twitching and convulsing as he dies and is riddled with bullets. In that moment, Neville wishes he could have found Cortman first, because Neville would have killed him quicker and with less violence. He would have ended it already. Cortman wouldn't have had to suffer. The new society eventually turns their attention to Neville, breaks in, shoots him, and captures him. Neville wakes up in a prison cell. Ruth, the woman from before, visits him, comforts him, gives him water, and they converse. Neville confronts her about the barbarism of the new society. Ruth tells him that all new societies are primitive and prone to violence, and that they won't stop because the undead vampires have no right to live amongst the living. Meaning these new innocent vampires, according to the other YouTubers, are going to slaughter the undead vampires more viciously than Robert Neville is. Now, there's some points that are true. Yes, Neville does kill innocent people, fathers, mothers, husbands, wives, and so on. Yes, Neville does become a legend and a superstition to the new vampires. Yes, Neville realizes this and understands the position that the survivors have. However, what's not true is that the vampires are a new society and are as functional as humans. Essentially, there's two outcomes of the virus. You died and reanimate and become the living dead vampire, or you survive and become a living vampire. However, the living vampires aren't violent and aren't feral. In fact, they are trying to suppress their vampiric traits. They are much closer to a cure than Robert Neville is. So, to say that the vampires Neville was killing were innocent is not true. Some of them were innocent. Neville's mistake was that he didn't realize he was killing living and somewhat civilized people because he failed to make the distinction between the living and the living dead. And the living vampires are far more brutal and callous towards the living dead. In that sense, if Robert is the villain of the story, like the YouTubers who pretend to have read the book proclaim, then the vampires who captured to execute Neville are also villains, if not more so. Again, I doubt the previously mentioned YouTubers are even aware of this duality of vampires. In reality, the book is far more nuanced. The book doesn't make Neville to be the villain because he's killing the vampires. The book highlights Neville's ignorance, but through Ruth's dialogue in the prison, it's clear that Neville was forced into this situation. He had a right and a good reason to kill the vampires, but again, he fucked up because he didn't realize there were two factions. Ruth tells Neville she understands his situation, that he was forced into it, but their new society is the order of things, and she reassures him, despite his protest about the brutality of their new society, that they will dispatch and dispose of the undead vampires. I Am Legend, the novel, is far more nuanced and profound than the pretentious pretend readers who made the YouTube videos I presented. I've wanted to dive into the I Am Legend franchise for a while now. But before I could sift through the franchise and derive any sort of meaningful analysis, I had to address what I saw as a significant issue. I feel like the lore has been tainted by, unfortunately, YouTubers I like. All of these YouTubers analyzing something they haven't actually read is sloppy, lazy, and does a disservice to the art they proclaim to love. Not only that, but they're actively lying to their audience. And their audience, who are in search of entertainment and thoughtful discussion, and who don't get paid to analyze art, are being fed misrepresentations and lies. And that's why I decided to make this video. Why is this important? Why am I so passionate about this topic? Well, simply put, so far, every video I've watched analyzing this franchise mentions the same poorly summarized notion that Robert is the monster, thus dropping all the nuance in the book. As someone who read the book, who likes cinema, who enjoys philosophy, who enjoys video essays, this type of sloppy work is insulting. Content creators should know better. They should be more accurate. They shouldn't be afraid of the nuance of the material they are covering. And more importantly, they shouldn't project the notion that they have a certain amount of knowledge to their audience when in fact they don't actually have that knowledge. You also shouldn't derive a creative work from other creative works when you have no idea what the creative work you're talking about actually is or communicates.